My name is Adrian Johnson, and I'm Director of Publications here at RUSI and a Research Fellow, and I'm also editor of the book Wars and Peace. And I'm joined tonight by two of the other contributors to the book. On my right, first of all, Professor Michael Clark, who's the Director General of RUSI, and to my left, Professor Malcolm Chalmers, who is the Director of Research at RUSI and also Director of UK Defence Policy here at RUSI. So we're very proud to mark the launch of our new book, Wars and Peace, which was indeed featured on this morning's Today programme. As Malcolm, you gave a brief rundown of some of your findings from the work for today's early risers. So a little bit about the book and how it came to be. Back in late 2011, we undertook a research project here at RUSI looking at the decision to commit British forces to Helmand province in 2005. And this became the Afghan Papers Whitehall paper, which was released in late 2012. And that built into actually a wider project when one of the authors said, one of the contributors to that volume said, actually what we needed was an audit of British military operations in Central Asia over the last decade. And this grew into something a lot wider. We said, well, actually, let's go beyond the so-called 9/11 wars. Let's go beyond the so-called Blair's wars and actually look at British military intervention since the end of the Cold War. And Malcolm's chapter in this volume explains actually why that's the key point of departure when looking at the trajectory of British military operations and an interventionist foreign policy. In October 2013, last year, we had a major conference here on Wars and Peace with some excellent speakers giving a good dissection of some of our preliminary findings. And that obviously then built into the final product you see here, and you have the opportunity to purchase at a discounted rate outside. So what we've tried to do with the book is tackle the strategic outcomes of British military intervention since 1991, their cost, and also their conduct. So, of course, there is the analysis of the interface of operations and strategy. I think throughout this period, the UK has been willing to use the military instrument in a broad conception of national interest. And few other states, perhaps only the US and France, have taken such a role since 1991. So as the UK takes pause after its embroilment in Afghanistan, when the latest Afghan war comes to an end, we think it is time to take stock and consider the lessons of over 20 years of an interventionist posture. And we had two objectives of this book: to first of all come up with a comprehensive audit of British military intervention, and also to be released ahead of Chilcot. So we've certainly got one of those objectives down. And I should also add that RUSI is now beginning a series of events, papers, and research on the coming SDSR, the coming Strategic Defence and Security Review. And more details on this will be available on the RUSI website, and also there are some flyers outside that outline some of our activities if you are interested. So, in the spirit of looking forward, each speaker tonight will summarize their findings from their own chapters of the book, and also perhaps talk about some of the book's conclusions as a whole, and then relate these to the future of British intervention. So, the panel discussion will run for about 40 minutes. So, we'll first have Malcolm starting off on strategic choices for the UK. Malcolm, please.
Adrian, thank you very much indeed for that. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the main findings of the book and then draw some speculative conclusions, remarks about where we go next. And I think one of the things that made us decide to write this book was a sense that we were at the end of a distinct era in British military policy, a thesis which can be challenged and which we may want to discuss, but a sense that this period from the end of the Cold War up until the end of the Afghanistan deployment was a distinct era, an era of intervention, which distinguished it from the previous era, which I would date from the withdrawal from east of Suez, the early 1970s, up until 1990, a period again of about 2 decades. And it was an era, I think, unique in British military history. I don't think there's a period quite like it, and there may never be a period quite like it again. It was certainly an era in which there was the biggest and certainly the most sustained military operations in post-World War II history. And really it's from that characteristic that the title comes, that we have this paradox in which on the one hand the Cold War was ended, the UK was freer from existential military threats than it's ever been in its history. But on the other hand, it was a period in which the frequency of military operations was much greater. We identified 10 significant military operations during this period, and there were others. So that paradox of wars and peace was deliberately part of our title. And it was a period in which, precisely because of one military operation after another, our armed forces all had to adapt and learn, and did very well, but they were learning at every level, tactical, strategic, operational, to a remarkable extent. They're very different from what they were in 1990 as a result of that experience. And all those associated with the military, those dealing directly as contractors in the field, those providing equipment, both large pieces of kit, but also those bits of kit necessary to meet urgent operational requirements, all had to change the way they operated. And those elsewhere in government, in the intelligence services, in DFID, in the Foreign Office, all had to adapt the way they operate. If you look at where the Foreign Office has its embassies today and where lots of our diplomats are deployed, they're very different today than they were in 1990 because of the experience of successive operations and the potential for further ones. So it's a very different, it's a very distinct era, I think, in our history. And it has some distinct characteristics. One is that after 2 decades of, broadly speaking, being on the strategic defensive in the latter part of the Cold War, trying to hold on to what we had in relation to keeping the line down the center of Europe in relation to the Soviet Union, deterring Soviet aggression on the one hand, and holding on to the Falklands and Northern Ireland on the other hand, that really defined the main function of our military was a defensive one during that period. But this period was about intervention. It was much more about the UK, along with the United States, being on the strategic offensive. We took part in 3 regime changes, and we also were involved in reducing the territory of a 4th. So that's quite a big difference. Strategic offensive as against strategic defensive in the previous era. And sometimes we were successful in that regard and sometimes not. But the end of the Cold War opened up a period in which the Western powers, including ourselves in particular, felt that we could make a change, we could lead, we could help stabilize. The end of history was not an empty phrase. It actually informed quite a lot of strategic thinking through much of this period. And secondly, I think we moved from a period in the 70s and 80s when we were beginning to look more like a normal European power in military terms, focusing on our own continent, to a period in which, albeit still with nuclear weapons, to a period in which I think UK exceptionalism increased in relation to our European partners. In particular, our global reach, our global aspirations were greater than they had been since the 1960s, and which certainly until 2010 and the SDSR, but certainly till 2010, you wouldn't have said the UK was about strategic shrinkage. And in a way, the significant defence cuts in 2010 and the mockery of the government's commitment to no strategic shrinkage was partly a reaction to the difference of the post-2010 period compared with the period from 1990 up until then. There wasn't, I think, strategic shrinkage of the UK compared with our European partners up until that time. And finally, I think all that was made possible, the more interventionist posture, the more ambitious posture during that period, was made possible by the fact that the risk of major power military confrontation was in recess. There was, if you like, a strategic holiday that we could intervene in former Yugoslavia, in relation to Iraq, in relation to Afghanistan, all theatres of major power conflict in the past, in the belief that the risk of escalation to conflict with Russia in particular, but also, I guess, others in future, we're thinking those risks were very small. And that facilitated intervention is one of the reasons why policies were much more interventionist during this period. And there were notable strategic successes. One of the things that the book talks about, one of my chapters, tries to conduct a stock take of strategic success, not about whether we achieved our operational objectives, whether our armed forces did what they were asked to do, but whether those interventions delivered strategic success in terms of broader national and indeed collective interests. And we come to the conclusion, as much as a way of provoking debate as to be definitive, that out of the 10 largest interventions, 6 out of 10 can, in our judgment, in retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, be seen as strategically successful. And I think I would suggest that the 2 clearest examples of strategic success were in relation to the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait in 1991 and the overthrow of the Taliban in 2001. And it's no accident, I think, that those 2 military operations were the most clearly successful because they were supported by a very broad international coalition in both cases, but also they were in support of very clear and internationally accepted norms. In the first case, reversing the annexation of a country by force, the extinguishing of a country by force, very important international norm which has been in the heart of international order since 1945. And the second case, taking action against a state that refused to give up terrorists involved in one of the worst acts of international terrorism we've ever seen, and as a result, very strong international support for the action we took. And there have also, I think, been a number of cases in which force for good action has been effective and has been widely supported. Sierra Leone, Bosnia, most clearly in that category. Where we've been least successful is in those operations, and the latter part of intervention in Afghanistan and in Iraq, I think, are the leading examples of this. Where we overreached, where our commitment to expanding democracy and building viable states through the use of the military instrument in Iraq after 2003 and in Afghanistan after 2006 failed to meet the very ambitious objectives we set. And part of the problem was the objectives weren't clear enough, but part of the problem was the objectives simply were too ambitious in retrospect. So that summarizes in 5 minutes what some of the conclusions of the book are, and I'm sure we'll come back to many of those in questions. But I don't think that vote necessarily means that the political consensus between what I think we can still call the 3 main parties is on military intervention if we get a situation like we did, like Kuwait in 1991 or Afghanistan in 2001, because I think the consensus amongst the 3 main parties, UKIP may be a different case, but I think in the 3 main parties, there's still, I think, I would argue, a consensus in this country, or indeed in the United States, that action should be taken if conditions like that emerge again. And I think also probably, less certainly there, if there were situations in which we felt we could act as a force for good and achieve objectives with a relatively limited use of military force, which could be contained in support of a limited objective, I think there would still be an appetite for that. But I think war weariness does apply in relation to open-ended, entangling commitments from which we are not at all sure we would, at the end of the day, feel that we have a strategic success. So things have changed there, I think, to some extent. I think there is still interest in stabilization of weak states and an awareness amongst our political elite, at least, that our concerns about terrorism, but also our economic concerns and our humanitarian concerns mean that when we get the sort of thing that's happened recently in Nigeria, there is still a natural instinct to say, what can we do? And we have sent British air and ground assets to Nigeria, as have the Americans and the French. And we still feel if there's an opportunity to do so, it's in our interest to strengthen the ability of the Nigerian state and the Nigerian security forces to tackle that sort of issue, because in a globalized world, the security of Nigeria matters to people in the UK for multiple reasons. And I don't think that instinct has gone away. But I do think that our appetite for deeper forms of intervention of the sort we've had in the last 2 decades, it will begin to decline, not only because of that general war weariness, but also because the return of major power military rivalry is beginning to increase the risks of intervention. Just in the last year, I think both the conflicts, the essentially internal conflicts in Ukraine and in Syria have been shaped by the shadow of Russian military power. And the shadow, the faint shadow, but nevertheless the shadow of the possibility of Russia-NATO military conflict has cast itself over both those conflicts. That's the reason why the Libya solution, such as it was, couldn't work in Syria, because Russia was not interested in Libya and it is interested in Syria. And that's why the Bosnia Balkans model doesn't apply in Ukraine, because in the end Russia was much less concerned to protect its clients in the Balkans than it clearly is in relation to Crimea at least. That doesn't mean we're about to see a big peaking of the risk of large-scale Russian NATO conflict. Both sides are cautious because of the existence of nuclear weapons, but also because in the end, if there were to be a large-scale conflict, the NATO conventional superiority is still very considerable indeed. And it does mean that if there were to be Russia-NATO conflict in future, it's likely to continue to be below the threshold of conventional conflict, triggered by weak states like Ukraine, and involving, I think, a growing role for unconventional forces. I mean, one of the lessons I would draw from the recent events in Ukraine, but also many of the other things that have been going on in the last couple of years, is that although I think our conventional forces need to take more seriously the need for conflict with peer states. So I think that we have to not only be thinking about, as some are tempted to do, structuring our forces around weak states and non-state actors. We also have to think seriously about overmatching potential peer competitors like Russia and China. Nevertheless, conflict with those countries is more likely to take place at a subconventional level. Cyber, the sort of men in without markings, special forces, subversion, intelligence, all those aspects are more likely to actually involve real conflict, precisely because there's a standoff at a conventional as well as clearly a nuclear level. And that means that we're going to have to continue to change. Our military is going to have to continue to change. It's not about back to the Cold War and reinvesting in tank regiments so much as making sure that we can continue to overmatch bigger opponents by being more flexible. It means the rest of government's going to have to change. The intelligence services, our police, and all the others involved in the security equation are going to continue to have to be involved in those areas. And it means those who support the armed forces, contractors, equipment manufacturers, can't just keep producing the same stuff. They're going to have to think of a broader range of support. And not least, society in some cases, certainly in cyber, is going to have to be part of that effort, because combating cyber challenges isn't one for government alone. And not least, I think, and here I think we're still digesting the political shockwaves from Sunday. I mean, it is a big deal that a non-traditional party has got more votes in a British election than the three traditional parties. And maybe this is a bubble. Maybe this will disappear come next year. But I don't think it will disappear entirely. And it is a big deal in security terms as well as domestic political terms. The UKIP vote was focused on the issue of immigration within the European Union. In truth, perhaps a response to the unprecedented economic crisis that hit Europe since 2008. But in that debate, I certainly was struck in that debate about immigration, how quickly it came down to a rather technical discussion about welfare for Polish immigrants and so on. And in that debate, I think we rather forgot how important it is that the UK's security since 1945 has been based around the construction of multilateral institutions within Europe, the European Union and NATO, that have helped provide a peace with our neighbours. And one of the biggest successes after 1990 for the European Union, for our security, has been the expansion of those organisations into countries like Poland and the Baltic states and Romania, and prospectively also into the Balkans. And the fact that we haven't talked much about Poland and Romania and the Baltic republics in our book is because we didn't need military operations. But if you look at the origins of the two world wars this century, they started, for us at least, with events in Serbia and in Poland. So these are not distant places of which we care nothing, or countries which we don't have to worry about our relationships with them in future. And therefore, a Europe in which France and the UK have now leading political parties who want to break up the European Union and impose controls on the movement of people from Eastern to Western Europe, have, I think, to answer questions about what the geopolitical consequences would be of the breakup of institutions which, for all their faults, were designed designed consciously in response to the horrific wars that Europe faced during the last century. And the idea that this is all about economics and it's not about security policy is, I think, a grave error which we don't want to go there. There's nothing new, of course, in this country about having political divisions about foreign policy. We saw it in the Cold War, where the left was more inclined to give some of the benefit of the doubt, at least, to the Soviet Union. But today, it's the right that's more inclined to give the benefit of the doubt. The far right is more inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to Putin. And it's no accident that that's the case, because both, in their very different ways, want a return to a Europe of nation states. They want to dismantle international institutions, or in Putin's case, international norms in relation to annexation of the territory of sovereign states. And they want to go back to a golden age of, well, when's the golden age for Putin or Farage, of Le Pen? Is it 1913? So, for discussion.
Thanks very much, Mark. A really, really good overview of both the book, but some of the questions the book raises and the UK will have to look at going forward. One very quick follow-up question, something that was almost skirted around in your remarks, but perhaps would be useful to sort of talk about very quickly in some more depth, and perhaps would be good to revisit in the Q&A. So the issue of great power rivalry, that's returned in a sense. And at the same time, recent polling highlights the importance of UN authorization, UN Security Council authorization in approval for military action. Now, given that this return of great power rivalry may complicate getting UN authorization at the Security Council for operations, How do you think this might interact? Because as we know, the UK has been no stranger to non-explicitly authorised operations. Of course, those can vary very differently in their perceived legitimacy, but what do you think this could mean?
I think if great power rivalry worsens and extends globally, so it's not simply about the immediate neighbourhood of Russia or China, but it also extends into proxy conflict in Africa or Latin America, then it would involve the UN becoming much toothless in the way that it was in large respects during the Cold War. But even in the Cold War, the UN played an important role as a convener and as a source of minimum legitimacy in important issues, even though it didn't play the active role it has since 1990. But I don't think we're yet at this stage as we were in the Cold War. And I think in Africa, for example, there's still quite a bit of cooperation and a potential for much more cooperation with China, for example, because we have things in common. That's what we should fear getting towards. But there are clearly some significant areas in which cooperation is less possible than it was in the past.
Well, turning now to international cooperation, we have Professor Michael Clarke, who's going to talk about a very important alignment the UK has had over the last, well, certainly since the end of the Second World War, but very uniquely since the end of the Cold War, the US-UK alignment. Mike, over to you.
Yes, Adrian, thank you. Yeah, my chapter in this was about the British-American alignment, since that's pretty key. And, I mean, in a sense, the chapter starts with the realization that there's nothing historically inevitable about close British-American relationships. If anybody goes to Bermuda for their holidays, you'll see huge fortifications on Bermuda. And right until the 1870s, they were against the United States, to guard against the possibility of a hostile US move. There was a plan in the what was then the old War Office. Right through to the 1930s, a military plan, which like all good military plans was kept up to date for the invasion of the United States by Britain. And that plan was extant. I don't know if anybody's taken it seriously, but it was an extant plan right through the 1930s. Now, more seriously, if you look at the argument between Neville Chamberlain and Anthony Eden in the run-up to the Second World War, Eden resigned from the government. And because he got to write the history of the situation, he got to put his own spin on it. And Eden always, as it were, created for himself the image that he'd resigned from the government because it was full of appeasers, because they wouldn't stand up to Hitler. That wasn't quite true. The real argument between Eden and Chamberlain was that Eden said, we must have the United States behind us. And if we've got the US behind us, we can stand up to Hitler. What Chamberlain said is we must have the Commonwealth and the Empire behind us. If we go to war with a disunited Commonwealth and Empire, we will lose, whatever the United States does. Now, whoever was right or wrong in that was the argument between them. And that was a genuine strategic argument about Britain's relationship with the US and what the US stood for in world affairs and how we should react to it. And that was only in 1938. So it's not that long ago. And it was the Second World War and the Cold War, of course, which has created the depth and the sense and the institutions that have given us the British-American relationship. And what I always say about that relationship is it's all top and bottom and not a whole lot in the middle. I mean, at the top, there's this friendship between leaders. There's a genuine warmth in many occasions. And when it feels cool, it really feels cool to us. And then at the bottom, or at the most detailed level, there is military cooperation, nuclear cooperation, intelligence cooperation. And these things are hugely important. And they're the specifics. They're the nuts and bolts of the relationship. And there's not a whole lot in the middle on a day-to-day basis. And officials appear in front of the Defence Committee all the time, the Select Committee. And I've been an advisor to the Defence Committee for a little while. And whenever officials say, oh, yes, we have a great influence on the United States, we always pass notes to the members saying, ask him how. Ask him for an example. And they never do. They can never give you a specific example. It's always a bit generic. But I don't need any convincing that the military, the nuclear, and the intelligence relationship is the real essence of the nuts and bolts of this British-American relationship. And so how has it fared in this period since the end of the Cold War? It didn't need to be reinforced particularly during the Second World War and the Cold War. Whenever we fell out, it was like a yacht, a well-designed yacht. Whenever we sort of leaned over it, we came back up to upright again. We frightened ourselves so much every time we fell out over Suez or Vietnam that we immediately rushed to mend the fences, bring the yacht back up to upright. And the question is now, have we got a bit more like a ro-ro ferry, a sort of flat-bottomed vessel, that a little bit of water comes in and we tip, and the more we tip, the more water we're going to take in, so that the effect of rows is cumulative rather than corrective? That's a question we should ask ourselves. And so in the last 20-odd years, here we are with our strong relationship with the United States, which was made all the stronger, certainly in the intelligence sphere, by 9/11. Which has reinforced the value of UK intelligence relationships, in some respects, where we are almost an equal of the United States, not in extent, but in specific skills and specific attributes, which is interesting. But if you look at that, what we're saying in this chapter, what I'm saying in this chapter, I take the view of Hugh Strawn. He says that throughout this period, Britain approached America's military with a combination of doctrinal awe and strategic confusion. We were in awe of the US revolutionary military affairs, of the ability of the US to really revolutionize a lot of its military capacities. And we shared with the US a sort of a strategic confusion about how we were using our forces. And we went from one fashion to the next in terms of what we thought we should do with them. But when we look at the figures that Malcolm said, we calculate 10 major operations, and 6 out of 10 of them were pretty successful. I made slightly different calculations in terms of splitting the operations up a little bit more. I make it as it were 11 operations, but they're the same things that we're talking about. And Britain and America collaborated in 9 of them, and we did 2 each, as it were, on our own. In Britain's case, it was the UNPROFOR involvement up to 1995 and Sierra Leone. In America's case, it was Somalia in 1992 and then Haiti in 1994. But all of the other operations we did together. And of those operations, I would say 8 or 9 out of 11, depending on how you count, were militarily very successful. But the 2 problems were the second phase of Afghanistan and the second phase of Iraq, the 2 most important operations, the one that casts a shadow over where we are now. And I quote shamelessly Malcolm's figures from his chapter in the conclusion, because I think these are worth bearing in mind when we think about the British-American relationship, which is that Britain is, in population terms, we are 20% of America. We're a fifth the size of America. So if we were doing this, if we were making the same military contribution as America, you would think that 20% would act as a baseline of calculation. But we deploy 14% of American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, not 20%. We took 10% of the casualties of the United States, not 10%, not 20% of the casualties. In cash terms, we spent 3.5% of what the United States spent. We spent about 28 billion pounds, as opposed to the $1.4 trillion that the Americans spent on Iraq and Afghanistan. And in terms of follow-on expenditure, because we do less for our veterans, and we expect to do less in the future, we are expecting to spend about £3 billion on our veterans, as opposed to the 600 billion pounds the United States could spend in the next generation and a half. Now, those discrepancies are pretty big. And you could draw different conclusions from these discrepancies, at least 3. One is you could say, have we passed a tipping point? I mean, what seemed like pretty big commitments to us in Iraq and Afghanistan were actually trivial by comparison with what the Americans put in. That's one way of looking at it. Or you could say, well, for the amount of influence we had with the United States, that was pretty crafty. Without spending so much money, with a difference in magnitude of commitment, we nevertheless maintained quite a lot of influence with the United States and with the overall strategic outcome. You could say that. Or thirdly, you could say, well, maybe what influence we have was not entirely due to military means. Maybe it was due to other things as well. Maybe we invested too much in thinking that the military buys us influence. And all of those conclusions are possible. We point out in the book simply the discrepancy in those 2 particular operations, the second period of Afghanistan, the second period of Iraq. And we offer that in the book as something to think about. So where do I think this takes us in terms of the future and the SDSR? I always call us we are the 10% partner. By and large, we spend about 10% of what the United States spends, orders of magnitude, on defense. We put about half of our GDP, half of what the Americans put in terms of GDP. We put in 2%, just about, and falling. The Americans put in 4%. So we are the 10% partner. And we by and large, get about 10% for it. We get about 10% of what the Americans have. Again, these are broad handfuls. So as the 10% partner, what do we offer? What can we do? And what we've always said in the past is, okay, we don't put it in these terms, but as the 10% partner, give us a piece of the battlefront, give us a piece of the problem and leave it with us. We've got all the facilities, we've got forces that can do more or less what your forces can do. Leave it with us. You don't need to worry about it. You've given it to the British. We've got our piece. So in 1991, in the Gulf War of 91, Peter de la Billière, commanding British forces, was very clear in his messages back to John Major. He said, I need more than one brigade. If you give me 2 brigades, we can have a division, then we get our own piece of the battlefront. Then we won't have to fight with the American Marines, who will go straight into Kuwait City and take a lot of casualties. That apparently was quite telling on Mr. Major. You know, if you make us integrate with the Marines, you will feel it. Whereas, give me a division, we've got a piece of the front, we'll run it in our own way. That view of how we interact militarily with the United States may be under a severe threat now because of the revolution in military affairs. Because the United States is very close and may already be in the process of really integrating the 6 domains of warfare. So, you know, subsurface, surface, land, air, space, and cyber. The 6 domains in which warfare is fought. Those 6 areas. Subsurface, surface, land, space, cyber, air. 6. If the United States can integrate its material, everything, across all of those domains, and I'm increasingly convinced that they can, then we cannot say to the United States, give us a piece of the battle space and leave it to us. We will have to accept from the US what it chooses to give us from its integrated picture of the 6 domains of warfare. We will be much more like small, reliable, useful allies who nevertheless can't take a piece of it themselves. And that's something which I think we're still thinking through. In military terms, we're still not sure how far it goes, and we're still not sure quite how we should contribute to it. But one thing is clear, that in the next SDSR, there is a view that we should spend more proportionately on electronic assets, C4I-STAR, the command, control, communications, computing, integrated targeting, acquisition, and reconnaissance, C4I-STAR. All of those, sorry, intelligence, not integrated. All of those assets are very expensive, and if we choose to spend more on those things, we will spend less on platforms, ships, tanks, and planes, which are already at relatively or historically quite low numbers. So I think there's a first, as it were, almost technical military issue which the SDSR will face, that if we want to plug into the United States in the way we did in the Cold War, the way we've done generally in these operations since the Cold War, we'll be doing it in a different environment, a different technical environment, which is harder and harder for us to keep up with in the way that we used to. It's not impossible, but we'll have to make probably more stark choices than we've had to make before. Second challenge is the famous rebalancing pivot to Asia and all that may or may not imply. I mean, we have big arguments here, as all think tanks do at the moment, as to how real is this so-called pivot to Asia. The United States, having announced a rebalancing, a reorientation, finds that just, it's typical, as soon as you make a political statement, events turn you into a liar. So as the United States makes the declaration, so it gets pulled into worrying about the effects of the so-called Arab Spring, the upheavals in the Middle East, so Europe becomes a great deal more threatening or more troublesome. And the United States finds that this pivot to the Pacific is annoying everyone in the Pacific because it doesn't seem to be very real. And I understand all of those things. But I take the view that ultimately this is a historical, close to a historical inevitability. This is the Asian century, sooner or later, in all sorts of ways. And the United States is a two-front power. And we've got used to the United States since Eden and Chamberlain. We've got used to the United States being an Atlantic first and a Pacific second power, always putting the Atlantic ahead of its Pacific interests. In the future, it is bound to reverse that order. And it's not that they will ignore the Atlantic or ignore the Middle East or ignore Europe, but it will be Pacific issues first. And it seems to me it's only a matter of time as to when that happens, and we don't know how it will happen, but it seems to me foolish to pretend that it won't. And so the issue for Britain, if we want to stay close to the United States, if we think that it is in our interests, as generally our defense establishment and our political elite always does, and I do as well, if it's in our interest to do that, what do we do? If the United States is going to be Pacific first, to put it crudely, do we go with them east of Suez, or do we backfill in a regional basis? Do we try and identify common strategic interests that really matter to the United States outside the European Mediterranean theatre? Or do we say, no, no, the best thing we can do in our strategic relationship is to take a more active role in our European integrated defence theatre and in the Mediterranean? Go back, in a sense, to a 1930s position where we say, this is what we really care about. This is what we most care about. And if we do that, we'll be doing it a bit more on our own than we traditionally have thought that we would. And the final issue, of course, is that which I've just mentioned, which is Europe itself. We used to say, you know, is the United States really involved in Europe in the 1990s? And a number of us said, Bosnia will probably be the last time that the United States comes back to Europe in a committed military sense, Dayton 1995, and, as it were, offers leadership and pushes leadership among the Europeans and some of the other powers to stabilize the European situation. That may be the last time. I think Libya does not disprove that view, that the United States was very reluctant to do more than get the party started and then, you know, lead from behind, all these sorts of phrases that were used. That the United States made it very clear that it wanted its European partners, once it had helped create the operation, to get on with it. And we used to say that the United States would not come back to Europe in a military sense unless it involved Russia. And then we started to say the United States will not come back to Europe in a military sense unless it involves Russia in some way that threatens the United States' more global interests. And that may still be the case, that the United States will only probably take leadership, real leadership, military leadership, of a European response if there is a crisis involving Russia, which by definition also affects the United States' conception of its global interests. And I think that's not an unreasonable position for the US to take, if not over Ukraine. I suspect it is taking that over Ukraine, but I think that's the direction in which it is likely to move. And when President Obama said that we accept that Russia will be a significant regional power, he was making the point. Russia is significant, but it's only a regional power. It is not a global player, and that was actually a rather well-made point. And so, in a sense, I come back, having written a chapter and contributed to the book in various ways that we all have, I come back to the view that the argument between Chamberlain and Eden may find itself being played out for different reasons, but it may be being played out with the same level of strategic significance in the next few years, which is to say it's not automatic that Britain and the United States will be militarily together. They will, of course, be kindred powers. But the United States may have strategic interests that are significantly different to the UK's strategic interests. We may have to keep working in a completely new environment at that relationship. I'd like to be wrong about that, but I suspect I'm not. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Very thought-provoking presentation, and reminding us that it's these it's these strategic choices that keep our jobs interesting, and that
yes.
perhaps the 2015 SDSR must be something more than merely an incremental exercise. But perhaps we can leave that to the discussion. So we have a good chunk of time now for Q&A, and I'd like to remind everyone that this is on the record. So we now have a couple of microphones that will be going around the room. So if you could raise your hand, and when a microphone comes to you, if you could first of all state who you are, and also make sure you have the microphone so we can all hear you. Now I have a wildly gesticulating Jonathan Isle here, who's one of the contributors to the book, who always has something interesting to say, so I think we'll let him go first.
I'm not sure that I do. I think just as an addition from other contributors, or at least from my own contribution and from the contribution of my colleague from YouGov, Joel Rogers. We try to look and to piece together some of the assumptions about public opinion and the military activities that the UK was involved in since the end of the Cold War. And I think I hope we succeeded, is debunking this sort of myth that somehow the public was hoodwinked by a prime minister who was determined to move into military operation. We looked back at all the public opinion polls from the early 1990s, and it turned out that every single time, without exception, at the end, with a possible slight exception of the Iraq intervention in 2003, the public supported the activities of the government. governments. On the day when troops were committed or when British military assets were committed, the public was firmly supporting the government position. The other myth that I think we debunked was the idea that the public pushed governments into a military intervention. Nay, if you remember, for those who are old enough to remember the 1990s, the something must be done demand. There's no evidence of that either. The John Major government withstood fairly successfully pressure from the public about intervention in the Balkans. And when the intervention did take place in 94 onwards, in the case of Britain, it was as a result of government decisions, the heavy stage of intervention. It was a result of government decisions, not necessarily as a result of public pressure. Furthermore, the assumption that the public needs to be told precisely what the mission is, and it will not support a mission unless it knows exactly what the purpose is. I'm sorry to say, it sounds very plausible, but we have found no evidence for that. What is clear is that as long as there is a strong narrative and there is some broad understanding in the political class about what the broad objectives are, as far as the general public is concerned, that's the end of the story. It might not be for the armchair strategists of various kinds, but I promise you, look at the figures, buy the book, read the chapter, and you will see it. But a final point, which I think sort of cuts through what my colleagues have said, is the one interesting thing, which still makes Britain and British public stand apart from the rest, is that in almost any crisis in which it was confronted and where the public was asked what should be done, the one answer that never came up is, it's got nothing to do with us, or what's it got to do with me? There was still a very global or globalist kind of approach to the crisis, a feeling that these are crises on which Britain ought to have a position, not necessarily always a military one, but certainly one in which Britain ought to have a position. So the little Englander or the little Britain sort of argument that sometimes came in the media was yet again not shared by the public.
So whether you'd like to come back on that?
This question of the public going along with it, even if they're not clear about it, it just reflects that view that British soldiers always follow their officers, if only out of curiosity.
Yes.
And we have a question at the back there, gentlemen. And if you could say who you are.
Thank you very much, Jonathan Marcus from BBC World Service. Two fascinating presentations, or 2.5 fascinating presentations after the last intervention. One phrase neither of you used was wars of choice, which I think it certainly in popular terms characterised much of this era, and I think is probably enshrines the sort of one of the main problems for us of this period. It was prompted in part by a Prime Minister who had an almost evangelical sense of what a military intervention might achieve. And I'm wondering, out of all of this experience, and this really comes to the way Michael ended your comments, is what is required in future a much clearer analysis of where British national interest lies, rather than the sort of vague military humanitarianism that seems to have developed in this period. And secondly, a much more rigorous analysis of those crises where the military toolkit itself is applicable in dealing with our national interest.
Let's go first.
Excellent question, I think. I think all the wars in this period were wars of choice, but it's very hard historically to think of examples where there isn't an element of choice involved. There's always choice involved, not only of whether you use the military instrument or not, but how you use it. The Falklands War was, in a sense, a war of choice. Now, the consequences of not taking that decision would, of course, have been very considerable, and I think the right choice was made, but there was a choice. There was a choice in September 1939 as to whether, how to act and whether to act in response to the invasion of Poland. There's always choices. But I think your characterization about what the UK interests are is a very important one. Again, I think the UK interests, as Jonathan described them, are defined in a different way from the way the Spanish or the Germans define their interests. They define them more broadly. They define them, in our country still, I think the public probably and the elite certainly see military force as something that can legitimately be used in support of international norms. So when Iraq invades Kuwait, there isn't a UK national interest involved. We didn't intervene there because of our oil companies. We intervened there in support of an international norm about the countries being extinguished by the use of force, and a very important international norm it is. So I think interest in that respect, interests on the one hand and humanitarian objectives on the other, actually in practice blur into each other to a very considerable extent. Where I think we perhaps got it wrong is in relation to your second criteria about the mix between military and other instruments, and a more critical judgment, a more searching judgment as to when the military instrument simply doesn't work, or the military tools we have at our disposal at a particular time just won't do the job. And sometimes you have to just say, look, the military instrument won't work here. I mean, Ukraine is the classic example of this. I mean, it's blindingly obvious to everybody that there isn't a Western military response in relation to Ukraine specifically. There is a Western military response in terms of reassuring NATO allies, and absolutely rightly we are doing that, and we've got British troops there now. But there isn't. Nobody's talking about sending British military troops to Ukraine because of the risks of escalation that would involve, and other instruments are being deployed. And I think certainly in a couple of the cases during the period we've been looking at retrospectively, we should have used a different set of instruments. But I don't think we should have said Iraq, the future of Iraq has nothing to do with us, or the future of Afghanistan has nothing to do with us, because we define ourselves as a country which should make a contribution not only to narrow national security, but to international stability. Because if nobody does that, then in the end it will come back to bite us along with others.
The philosophical point that there's always a choice, I absolutely agree with. 1940 is a great example, actually, because France took the view in 1940 that it was better to make peace and save Paris and live to fight another day, live to rise again, because of the view that the French took about their own place in the world and history, that losing the battle with the German blitzkrieg was a catastrophe, but it was a catastrophe from which France would recover. Whereas in the United Kingdom, Churchill created a mood and atmosphere that this was a catastrophe we could not live with, the idea of being occupied. And there is a plan, which is in the archives. I've not seen the plan, but I've seen photographs of it, handwritten plan by Lord Ismay, that Churchill had him draw up in 1940 for the defence of Whitehall, building by building, floor by floor, including this building. They were going to fight every building, every floor in every building, right the way down Whitehall, including Parliament, including Westminster Hall, built before the Norman Conquest. And the whole thing, 1,000 years of history, they would fight for all of it as a symbol to the rest of the world that there'd be no surrender to fascism. And for Churchill, if we lost that battle, that was it. Our island stories, he kept calling it, would come to an end as far as he was concerned. So that was a choice he made. That was totally different to the choice the French made, for perfectly good reasons, because of the way, these days we say, the way the narrative was interpreted, what the war represented. The French took one choice, we took another. And that would have happened if the Germans had invaded. They would have fought all the way down, building by building, right through to Westminster Hall, and defended it, and lost. Where we are now is that all wars are optional, and it's not a binary thing. It's not some are optional and some are compulsory. There's a spectrum as to how we feel it. And as Malcolm said, we take the view that our role in the world is supplemented by what we do in the world militarily. And we, like the United States, tend to react with military resources. The Germans tend to want to pay for things. The Italians tend to want to, and the Japanese want to pay for things. The Italians want to convene conferences. Everybody makes contributions in their own way, and our contribution tends towards the military because we think it's a strong card in our hands. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's what we tend to do. But the problem for the last 20 years is the public has got this view now that defence expenditure is actually it's optional. We spend according to how we want to feel about ourselves in the world, not how it affects us. And that's a slightly difficult situation in which we are now finding ourselves. It's how we choose to spend 2% of our GDP to feel this way about ourselves. That's where we are, I think.
I'm going to go to this side of the room very quickly for some questions. So there was a question from the gentleman here. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Christopher Elliott, Associate Fellow of the institution. Malcolm, very much enjoyed what you had to say, but I felt towards the end, and do correct me if I'm misquoting you, that it was slightly business as usual, and that once we got over our war wariness, we would be as eager or not to re-engage in expeditionary warfare. As an aside, I think that the mood of the population is different from that. They believe that they didn't get results for the expenditure and treasure and lives that things, and they're going to need reconvincing about that before people will willingly support other interventions. Clearly, if it's an issue of national vital interest, that's different. But talking about the sort of wars we do, I think that the confidence in the decision-making has collapsed as far as that's concerned. But that's not my point. Since you made your prediction, there has actually been a collapse in military capability, which is much more important. Following the 2010 step down in capability and then the 3-month review, we are far less capable than we were. And rather echoing what Michael said, we no longer have these. Well, we had 4 domains, and they've added 2 on, and we didn't catch up with that. But we can't even do the 4 domains now. So surely your statement that it's business as usual, if I haven't misquoted you, needs to be seen in the light of the fact that we just don't simply have the same military forces as we did have even 4 years ago.
Great question, Christopher. I think in terms of the appetite, I don't think I use the term business as usual, but I think there is a reaction against these entangling, extended stabilization operations, which we had in Afghanistan and Iraq. But actually, since the narrative of relative failure and high cost in those operations had been established, we had the operation in Libya, which everybody was surprised. People read the SDSR and said that rules out things like the Libya operation. And it clearly didn't. And it had support across the political spectrum in the elite. So I could be totally wrong. But my instinct would be that if you get a Libya-type situation in which there is a UN Security Council resolution, there's broad regional support, the risks of escalation to entanglement on the ground are limited, and there's a good cause, and I think we could well do something like that again. Where I think we won't get involved are much less likely to get involved, is somebody comes up with a plan to invade a country and establish an occupation regime which involves the UK taking responsibility indefinitely for running an area where quite a lot of people are going to fire things at us. I think that's much less likely, but that's a subset of the universe of interventions. There's an awful lot of other things which my instinct is we are still likely to want to get involved. Now, on your second question of capabilities, absolutely the right question to ask. But I think the key thing is that in almost all those interventions we were involved in, we only got involved because the United States was involved also. And in those contexts, the question of whether or not to intervene isn't really determined by how substantial our capabilities is, because in the end we come with what we can do because we're coming in behind the Americans. What it does do, and this is Mike's point, it makes a difference to how much of the effort the UK can have and what sort of contribution we can make to the effort. And depending on the nature of the operation, it's likely to make us more dependent on the American system of systems, if you like, than we were in the past. So I think it will make it more difficult for us to take responsibility for specific geographic sectors than we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. But for the reasons I gave earlier, I think that's the least likely sort of operation we're going to be involved in. We would not, as a UK, have taken part in the Libya-type operation or in the Libya operation if the Americans hadn't been there. And they may have been leading from behind, but it was a very substantial behind, and it was a backstop, and we knew that in the end, because the Americans were there, that they wouldn't let us down, and the risk we were taking was much less.
Yeah, don't disagree with that at all. On the Libya thing, I mean, we didn't go into the Operation Libya thinking that the Americans were going to then draw down their involvement. I mean, that was a bit of a surprise. And I think, I described the Libya case as it was kind of okey-cokey diplomacy because, the United States was in, then it was out, and the Germans were out, then they were a bit in, and then the Turks were in, and they were out, and the Italians were out, and they were in, they're out. The only power that was completely consistent was Colonel Gaddafi, and he was mad.
Question over here.
Mike Gapes, MP. I wanted to make two comments and then a question. The comments are, I think 1953 is the year you're looking for, because it's prior to the Crimea being moved, and it's also when Nigel Farage would have been most happy. But to make a serious point, public opinion is very interesting. The biggest fundraising charity is Help for Heroes in terms of its public impact. That's very new. All the Remembrance Day services that I go to each year, we have more and more people coming, especially children, and there is a shift. And I've been in Parliament 22 years. It exactly corresponds to 92 until now. It corresponds to your book, and certainly there is much greater support in an overt way, I think, for the armed forces in the general public than there was. Yeah. But nevertheless, there's also, as all the opinion polls indicated, and certainly over the debate we had on Syria, there is a reluctance for intervention, partly, I think, based upon hindsight, which is always a wonderful thing. And I'm not so convinced that a Libya-type operation would necessarily be supported, given that people know that all this weaponry has come out of Libya, destabilised a whole number of other countries in the region and led to terrorism and activities going on elsewhere. Now, I'm not saying I was absolutely in favour of what happened, but I think people will look at unintended consequences and maybe be more cautious. So I wonder whether we are actually in Britain becoming more and more like the Germans. And that worries me because it means that bad people will do things in a way on our continent and nearby, and there'll be very few people who are prepared to intervene. Maybe the French will in their former colonial areas in Africa, and we might go and support them as we are doing, and maybe limited things will be done to help the Nigerians, but we're worried about their human rights and the way their military and their authorities might behave, so we're reluctant to do too much alongside them. But really, where are we going to be? And my final question, really, given the tensions that there are between Japan and China, the incidents in the disputed waters with Vietnam, potential rise of a more dynamic and maybe a more assertive India, it won't just be that the United States will be focusing on that part of the world. Perhaps we might have to too, because we've got trade routes, we've got economic interests, and how are we going to afford that?
A small self-contained question. Would you like to go first, Malcolm?
Thanks, Mike, for the I think I counted 3 questions, but I'll maybe not answer all of them. And I accept your observation about how the armed forces are viewed, and I think that is actually very important. Whether it's lasting, whether this continues as the as the memory of Afghanistan fades, remains to be seen, but I think it probably will. On Libya, we had a strategic scorecard which gave a very provisional assessment of each of the 10 most significant military operations. And Libya, we said it was on balance not a success, but we put a question mark. Basically, too early to say. So I think we would share your view that Libya seemed a strategic success at the time, but the more things develop there, the more you do wonder whether actually that's the case. We just don't know. I think it's also true that the answer to your last questions in relation to whether we're becoming more like Germany, which I don't think we are, but also the impact of events in Asia, it really does depend. I mean, I'm a bit of a skeptic of the idea that there are inexorable trends which are just going to play out and we just have to wait for them to play out. A lot will depend on events. They'll depend on the internal politics of China, which could be about the machinations of a very small number of people at the top of the Communist Party. It could depend on whether, on events in the East China Sea between the Japanese and Chinese navies, and whether somebody makes a mistake and a frigate is sunk and 200 Chinese sailors go to the bottom of the sea and you get a war there, or you manage to avoid that. These things really matter. Right now, I think China is becoming, the Chinese leadership is becoming more willing to take risks as its military strength grows. But its appetite for risk is not limitless. And I don't think China is yet in the situation in which it's prepared to take a substantial risk of war, certainly not with the United States, but even, I think, with Japan, because they know that if they got into a full-scale war with Japan, even if it didn't involve the Americans, and it might, the risks of humiliation for their armed forces are still quite considerable. So I think they'll be cautious. They're picking off. They're perfectly prepared to humiliate the Vietnamese and Filipinos because they're weak. But they're not prepared to take on stronger powers. In relation to what that means for the UK, I think it's very hard. I mean, I think the UK has some military presence in Asia-Pacific. It has some commitments there, 5-power defence agreement, some residual commitment in South Korea and so on. And our Royal Navy deploys there quite a bit. For us to pivot towards Asia without a very substantial and unrealistic increase in the defence budget would mean pivoting away from somewhere else. And I think, given where we are now, I think it would be strange for us to take resources out of NATO and take resources out of our commitments in the Middle East and deploy them to the Asia-Pacific. I mean, and we might be in a danger of where the Americans are, because part of the problem with declaring a pivot to Asia for the United States has been that the Europeans are pissed off because they think they're being abandoned, and the Asians are pissed off because they don't really see this pivot arriving. So maybe shifts are always a good thing to consider, but we need to be very careful about declaring them. Otherwise, it could end up being an own goal.
Let me just follow on from that. Germany, you talked about the change in Germany, and I always say when people in NATO complain, oh, the Germans won't do this and the Germans won't do that and they won't gear themselves up, I say, look, this is the Germany we wished for 150 years. Get used to it. This is a strong civilian power who is deeply, deeply wary of getting involved in military operations. And that, I think, is a real generational change. That's not temporary. I think this is at the heart of the new Europe. And so when we talk about, if it is the case that Europe is now back on our agenda, not just because of Ukraine, but also because of instabilities in the Eastern Mediterranean, the ripple effects from the Arab Spring, the Middle East uprisings, the human insecurity created by the fallout from the economic crisis. We've done a lot of analysis of that in RUSI. For all sorts of reasons, both as a human security and hard security, Europe is probably not going to feel as benign or as quite as prosperous a place as a whole as we've come to feel it in the last 30 or 40 years. And if we're going to address that, then we have to address it with the understanding that Germany is not the sort of power that it was, which makes it even more complicated for Britain to say, this actually we should rededicate ourselves to our region, to the security of our region, because we can't do easy deals, and we've got to be much more subtle about that. And I think it's a really important point. And then just the first thing you mentioned, Mike, is that the boys and girls in the armed forces are still extremely popular. The charities are doing well. And that's a two-edged weapon. Because, again, as we've analysed here a couple of times, the British public at the moment, and people are going to hate me for saying this, are uniquely sentimental about the armed forces in a way that is historically quite unusual. And we're producing something at the moment called Heroes or Victims. The military are either the heroes or the victims. And the vast majority are neither. The vast majority are in between. They're not heroes, they're service personnel. And the vast majority, they're not victims. And the problem is there's this view that everybody coming out of Afghanistan is mentally scarred. It's not true. Simply not true. I mean, there are issues, but they are very specific issues, and they've got to be thought of carefully. The Wootton Bassett effect, for the best of intentions, people at Wootton Bassett, out of respect, created this ritual, which was very affecting. It affected me in lots of ways, every time I saw it. Very affecting. But the fact is, the military didn't want to say anything in public about it, but they were very wary of this, because every time there was somebody coming through Wootton Bassett, every time a body was repatriated, the way it was presented is another victim of government policy, another victim. And the point is, the military are not victims. They're instruments of government policy, not victims of it. And so this rather sentimental view we have of the armed services is partly because our society deals in recreational grief these days. Grief is not personal these days. It's collective, it's recreational, it's what we are. And we could talk about this all night. But it seems to me that the military have got to cope and deal with that. And being either heroes or victims isn't actually very helpful.
Okay, we have just over 10 minutes left for questions, and I've got quite a few already queued up. So what we're going to do, we're going to take them in threes, and if you could be very brief with your questions, please.
And the answers.
So first, the microphone, go to that lady over there. Just wait for the microphone. And also, if you could have the other microphone on the other side of the room, go to the gentleman there in the blue shirt. So please go ahead first.
Yeah. Mary Dushevsky, I write a column for The Independent. I would be, with great trepidation, I'd like to take issue with a couple of things that have been said. One of them, what Jonathan said about debunking a myth that people were hoodwinked into supporting the intervention in Iraq. I don't think that was the myth. I think a myth has grown up that there was support for the intervention before, which I don't think is true. I was diplomatic editor at The Independent at the time, and I was writing some of the very anti-Iraq war editorials. But the moment the troops went into Iraq, our whole line had to change. We didn't support the intervention, but we supported the troops because we knew that anything else would go down extremely badly, and that was the paper's line. So I think there's a difference here. Second point I'd like to take issue on is almost everything that Malcolm Chalmers said about Russia. And I'll just take 2 specific points. One of them, the idea that Russia is back. I don't think Russia ever went away. I think Russia is back because the West, in the form of the US and the EU, expanded, or at least started to interest themselves in places that Russia considered vital to its interests, and I think the same goes for Syria. So that I think that if that degree of interest had been shown by Western powers before, then Russia would have been back before. The second thing is what you said about the far right and Putin. I think that's a very dangerous point because I, for one, think that the EU had a degree, at least, of culpability in the run-up to Yanukovych's decision not to take the association agreement. The moment Nigel Farage said, I think that the EU had some blame, then that particular point, which I don't think is a stupid point, immediately became associated with Farage and dismissible. And I think the same goes for associating Russia and Putin with the far right, because that means you can you can ignore what Putin and Russia are actually saying, because you say, oh, well, that's the same sort of thing as the far right is saying. I think that means that we don't listen properly and we don't take things seriously. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question over there. Please be very brief so we can get lots more in. Thanks.
Josh Arnold Forster, member of the Institute. I used to work in the MOD 2005, 2006. Just, Malcolm, and I welcome your comments about your sort of mentions of the non-military instruments of global power. And I was just wondering, or British power in conflicts, I was just wondering whether now is the time for a similar audit of those functions to be taken place. So that, and this isn't a job for RUSI, maybe Chatham House or the Overseas Development Institute, but there are a series of questions surrounding issues like why did Germany recognise Croatia early? Why was the governor of Helmand Province removed in 2005? All of those sorts of questions which may or may not be sensitive, I don't know, and may or may not demonstrate how what those non-military instruments of power contributed either to the success or failure on the scorecard that you used.
There was another question from the back. The lady's disappeared, so we'll go to the gentleman there in the purple tie. And please be very brief.
I'll try. Ian McNichol, previously Royal Air Force. I was struck by the success and failure points that were made, and particularly since we learn more from failure by the failure points. You suggested that we'd overreached ourselves. I wonder if we've understood how far we still have yet to reach, in that Iraq was not just a regime change, but in fact turned into a struggle between Sunni and Shia, and Afghanistan, of course, continues to be a struggle against an extremist and fundamentalist and deeply unpleasant ideology, and that both of these things still exist.
And we'll actually take 4 questions, so if the microphone could just come to the gentleman here, and then we'll answer this round of 4 questions. Yes, thank you.
Richard Mottram, former civil servant. I thought Michael Clarke's presentation was terrific, but the idea that the Americans will successfully integrate the 6 domains and that we'll be chasing after them, a very familiar thing in our way of thinking about things, slightly crossed in my mind with the idea that America, that can almost do this already, had just struggled in 2 very long campaigns. So are we not into the sort of classic delusion that technology will enable you to answer what are much more complex strategic questions?
Some very good questions there. So, Mike, would you like to go first?
Yeah, just quicker on that, Richard. A good point. I mean, the point is that the Americans are far ahead of anybody else in this, and it's a game that only they can play for the future. So it seems to me that the logic of their battle planning or their operational planning is one that will just get more and more internal, from which it will be difficult for allies to take a piece of. And I think we've always said that we are strategically significant when we do things with the United States militarily. And there are allies, let's say the Netherlands, who are perfectly good allies. They're well respected, but they're not big enough to make a strategic difference. They're just useful to have on board. So the question is, if we think we've made a strategic difference militarily in the past, we'll find that more difficult in the future. However slowly the United States goes towards this great integration, and it may be a long time before it comes, but they're so far ahead of anybody else that it seems to me that will be one of the realities. And we have to ask ourselves, does the strategic leverage we think we want, does it come through the military instrument by being able to take a piece of the action? Or actually, are we in a completely different ballpark now, a completely different game? And we're not in a very good position in the next SDSR to really start considering that, would be my point.
Did you also maybe want to tackle the question about success and failure and regime change turning into much more...
Oh, yeah. I mean, Ian makes a great point. I mean, what we've had for some years is a one-shot war-fighting force. We can fight a war, a significant sized war in alliance, but one shot. And when it comes to sustainability, that's when we struggle. And that's the problem. When we gave ourselves in Iraq and Afghanistan as it were, open-ended strategic objectives, and then we tried to do 2 campaigns at once. And I was sitting in the Defence Committee when Jeff Hoon was asked, if we cannot get out of Iraq in time, can we still go to Afghanistan in the force? And he said, yes, I'm assured that we can. And at the levels that were being contemplated then, 3,300 troops maximum to Afghanistan, that was true. But that was always too low a number for what Helmand turned into. So I absolutely agree. It's these open-ended commitments where we think we've got a one-shot, fast-in, fast-out force or a low-level, sustainable force. And if you fall in between those 2 stools, you struggle, which is exactly what we did.
Malcolm, do you want to tackle the first 2 questions in that round?
I will. I'll tackle Josh's question. First, if I may, I mean, you'll see when you buy the book, Josh, that excellent, even better, that we do try to talk about that, as it were, the political, diplomatic context, because you have to in order to make a strategic assessment. So this isn't simply an audit of the military operation, but it is an audit of military operations in the round, as it were, and key are exactly the sort of political decisions you're taking. I mean, that is one of the key components of determining success. So we do talk about that. Maybe there's more that needs to be done in that regard, particularly in relation to use of those non-military instruments in cases where the military is not deployed, which is the majority of cases. So that's very important. On Mary's really excellent questions, I mean, I'm not sure we disagree as much as she thinks. I think that, however, that there were some differences in the way that Russia handled this crisis compared with some past crises. After all, the sort of regime change and alternation of power between different communities and different factions within Ukraine is nothing new. We've had the situation since the creation of Ukraine as an independent state about contested elections, presidencies being overthrown as a result of demonstrations in the street, and so on, and reflecting the fact that Ukraine is a deeply divided society. Russia has a stake there, and also a lot of Ukrainians believe that Russia should have a stake there, but also there are other Ukrainians who deeply want to join the Western community of states and want to be like Poland. So Ukraine is a deeply divided society, and the way that's manifested itself partly is an economic failure and a dysfunctional state and a divided state, but it's partly manifested itself in an alternation of presidencies between those representing those two different tendencies in Ukrainian society. What happened in the events era this year, and indeed towards the end of last year in the EU association agreements and then their failure, is that it culminated in Russia taking the decision to annex the part of Ukraine which was most sympathetic to them, not simply doing what they did in Georgia, which is autonomous, recognizing parts of Georgia which had long been separate from Georgia actually de facto, but in this particular case annexing. And I think that is a significant additional step, a breach of international norms comparable to what Iraq tried in relation to Kuwait in 1991. And I think for Western states, for better or for worse, but I think for better, our policies are influenced by the importance of international norms protecting small states as well as large states. And that's one of the important reasons why this has happened. I mean, if there's simply been some armed men in Crimea who'd established control and the Russians have said this is something that's got to be sorted out within the context of Ukrainian politics, then I think the reaction from the West would have been significant, but it wouldn't have been anything like as significant as it was. But this is uncharted territory. And I think the other point I would make there is that, I mean, it goes back to what I said about the model of Europe that was created after World War II. And it was one which I think one of the stabilizing features of the model we created after World War II, it was about the rights of small states as well as large states. It was about saying that the future of Central and Eastern Europe isn't something to be negotiated and decided upon by the great powers, as it always has been historically. It did involve actually recognizing the rights of the Poles and the Czechs and the Slovaks and yes, the Ukrainians. Now, the problem we've had is that model of the way to organize things in Europe, which were an extension of that model from Western Europe into Eastern Europe, came up against a Russian model. Again, very understandably, I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong, but increasingly it played into the Russian feeling of humiliation at the end of the Cold War, which was greatly deepened by the economic crisis they had in the 1990s. And understandably, in that context of humiliation and exclusion, Russia felt that NATO enlargement into Ukraine was unacceptable, because they had an image of NATO as something, and indeed subsequently the EU, as instruments of aggression in a zero-sum game in Europe. The dilemma, I think, for the West has been that for the West to accept that Russian narrative wholesale would have meant basically saying that they want to negotiate the fate of the countries in between over the heads of the citizens of those countries. And that's something which Western leaders not only not prepared to do, but find it very difficult to do in practice, because Ukraine is not simply an object of policy, it also is a subject, or indeed multiple subjects. And in the specific case of EU association, I think EU leaders can be held culpable perhaps of not thinking about geopolitics enough when they're thinking about technical association agreements. But what's the alternative? What was the alternative? Was there really an alternative there which would have allowed Ukraine to be simultaneously a member of the Russian-led customs union and a member of the European Union? Or was the alternative actually to say, well, it should be part of the Russian sphere of influence? It's not. I'm still not clear whether there was a viable alternative which would have involved Russia and EU having joint agreements with Ukraine.
Okay, we're now going to go to the one-liner round. So literally one-line questions. So first of all, Knox, just sitting there at the back. Very, very quickly. And then we'll go to Trevor very, very quickly.
Thank you, Knox Chittier, Chatham House. Just a very brief question. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the Anglo-French, I don't know if you can call it alliance or strategic relationship in recent times and going forward. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, particularly in the global context. Thank you.
And Trevor, so you get the last question, but make it a quick one. And Malcolm, you'll get this one.
Yeah.
If current acquisition trends continue, and our interest is in the industrial side of this, will the UK government be able to claim that it enjoys operational sovereignty over UK forces? And if it can't claim that, will this have an effect on the public's readiness to support British defence?
Mike, let's go first.
On Anglo-French, Knox, it was a very strongly worded agreement that came out of almost out of nothing in 2010. Liam Fox was very keen on it. I have to say the MOD had to scratch its head and think about what to put into all of this. It was politically led, and then they had to sort of make some sense of it. And it's been disappointing. It's there. It matters at the moment more to Paris than it does to London. It may turn out to be, given what we've said, it may turn out to be more important. But so far, it has been more paper than reality.
On Trevor's question.
This is a summary of a debate that Trevor and I have had in the office for probably years. I'm not sure if it makes as much difference as you're implying it will. I think the tension is perhaps between a public that thinks we are more sovereign in military affairs than we are, and a government that, at least when it's in government, realizes how dependent we are on our relationship with our allies to actually do things. Because if you look at the operations in the period we've studied, almost all of them, as Mike said, have been ones which have involved us fighting alongside the Americans. I think the question we analysts perhaps should ask is whether it's in the UK interest looking forward to have more operational sovereignty, because the Americans might not be involved as much alongside us as they have been in the recent past.
Well, every good event ends with another question. And it's been a very rich and varied discussion. I'd like to thank both the panelists, but also you, the audience, for making it such an interesting discussion of the book's findings, but also looking forward to some of the big questions that whichever direction UK goes, we'll have to answer.